Good evening. Thank you everyone for tearing yourselves away from events in Washington to events in Hollywood. Today we're very pleased to have with us Mark Glancy, who's written many books, mostly on subjects to do with Hollywood and the connection with Britain. So who better to tell us about Cary Grant? Mark may casually drop in the fact that he has a new book out, published this week, called Cary Grant, The Making of a Hollywood Legend, which I can highly recommend. But now he's going to tell us about Cary Grant and Hitchcock. If you have any questions for him, please write them in the chat and we'll get to them afterwards. We'll try and answer as many as possible. So now over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Nikki. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Nikki, and thank you to the team at Westminster Libraries for inviting me and for setting all of this up. It is quite something to set up, so I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the opportunity to talk about Cary Grant and Alfred Hitchcock, two of my absolute favorite filmmakers. They made 4 classic films together: Suspicion, Notorious, To Catch a Thief, North by Northwest. Really fascinating films. I'm going to speak about each of them tonight. So as Nikki said, my talk arises from my biography of Cary Grant. I researched the biography using Cary Grant's own personal papers, which are held in Los Angeles in the library. And there, amongst his many papers, it's a vast collection. He kept a lot of stuff. Amongst this vast collection, there was a file cataloged, a file labeled Correspondence with Alfred Hitchcock. And on my very first day with the collection, I said, can I see that file that's Correspondence with Alfred Hitchcock? Amongst other things, I was very keen to see. I wanted to see what they were writing to each other about. And they weren't long letters, actually. They weren't even very detailed letters. They weren't letters about filmmaking. They were surprisingly personal, fond, affectionate letters, sometimes about Christmas plans, sometimes about birthday wishes, or thanking each other for gifts. And the letters were often signed Love Carrie or Love Hitch. They were personal enough that when we get towards the end, I'll quote from one that brought a little tear to my eye on a Monday morning in the archive. So the warmth of their relationship really surprised me. They seemed to be such unlikely friends. Hitchcock was famous for saying that actors were like cattle, and so I didn't imagine that he socialized with them. And they seemed so different in terms of disposition. Hitchcock being the macabre, dour, introverted genius, Cary Grant being the light, bright, charming, jet-setting superstar. So as I did more research, using Cary Grant's files as well as film production files, script files for the films, I came upon more and more evidence of just how much they enjoyed working together and how they found themselves to be in sync creatively, interested in exploring the same ground as filmmakers. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. If we can have the next slide, please. So here you see a picture of them on the set of their first film together. That's Suspicion. They're shooting a scene from Suspicion. Cary Grant, of course, in bed, Hitchcock in the middle, and Harry straddling behind the camera. So their first film together, but these quotations below the photograph are from the end of their careers. Cary Grant told a film historian that he was always whistling on his way to work when making a Hitchcock film. He actually said this over and over again in various different ways, that he just really enjoyed being on set with Hitchcock. Hitchcock, meanwhile, on the other quotation, privately told a friend that his association with Grant was the greatest he ever had with any actor, and that Grant was the only actor I ever loved. Now, I came to understand the bond between these two men in both personal and professional terms. Personally, they had a lot more in common than I realized. Professionally, I think they really they encouraged each other to defy expectations, to be more daring, to be more experimental. And I think they really enriched each other's careers immeasurably. So let's start with what they had in common. Next slide, please. Both men were originally British working class boys, and I think it's fair to say that they had very limited prospects in life. Grant later said that his friendship with Hitchcock was based on the fact that they both knew what licorice all sorts were. And if you don't know what licorice all sorts are, and I didn't know before I read this, it's a type of sweet or candy beloved by British schoolchildren. So Cary Grant said that this was their bond, and he's joking, of course, but it's his shorthand for saying that it's their shared background as British working class boys that was at least a part of their bond. So Hitchcock was born in 1899 to a family that owned a greengrocer's shop in Leytonstone on the northeastern edge of London. And that's Hitchcock's father in front of his shop there. I think you can just about make out Hitchcock written above the fruit that's hanging there. Hitchcock's father in front of the shop, and some sources say that that is young Alfred on the pony. Other sources say that's his older brother William. But it's the closest thing we have to a photograph of Hitchcock, of the Hitchcocks in their childhood home. The Hitchcocks seem to have hit on hard times. When young Alfred was just 7, the family left Leytonstone, which is a kind of distant suburb of London, and moved back into the city, into the East End, to Limehouse, a much poorer neighborhood, where they lived above their fishmonger shop. So it's a downwardly mobile move that signifies some financial trouble. And like, excuse me, like most working class boys, Hitchcock left school at 14 and went to work at a fairly menial job. Cary Grant, you see on the other side of the frame, young Cary Grant was born as Archie Leach in Bristol in 1904 to a much less affluent family than the Hitchcocks even. His father did not have a shop of his own, but worked in a clothing factory. And Archie ran away from home when he was 14 to join an acrobatic troupe that was based in Brixton, but toured Britain for many months of the year, performing in music halls and acts that included gymnastics, exotic dances, a lot of stilt walking. That was their specialty. Very physical form of comedy and athletic spectacle. So both men had the most basic education. Both men had left school by the time they were 14. And I think it's fair to say that show business offered them each opportunities they never would have had otherwise. Opportunities to travel, which they both loved traveling throughout their lives. Opportunities for creative fulfillment, opportunities for wealth beyond anything their parents could have imagined. So they met each other in Hollywood in 1939. And by this time, by the time they were in Hollywood saying hello to one another in 1939, they had completely reinvented themselves. Hitchcock had reinvented himself as the eccentric master of suspense with this heavy English accent and dour English manner, probably exaggerated in public for effect. This was his public persona. Grant had reinvented himself as the debonair, charming, perfectly dressed star of screwball comedies with a distinctly unplaceable accent. Jack Lemmon in Some Like It Hot says nobody talks like that because Cary Grant had this transatlantic accent that didn't sound like anyone else's accent. So in Hollywood, thousands of miles from their original homes, they were probably uniquely placed to see through each other's new invented personas. Most Americans wouldn't be able to place them in terms of class or background, but I would guess that they could place each other very, very quickly, actually, and perhaps even admire the reinvention that they saw in each other. See through each other on the one hand, but also admire what they'd done. So they were doing very well when they met in 1939. Hitchcock had just arrived in Hollywood, but he was Britain's most famous director at that point. He came over to Hollywood in 1939, having made many British films. Cary Grant's film career had begun 7 years earlier in 1932, and it was very slow to take off. For several years in the 1930s, it looked like Cary Grant wasn't going to amount to much. If we can have the next slide, please. So Cary Grant spent the first 5 years of his career at Paramount, under contract at Paramount Studios, making 5 or 6 films a year. These were really busy years for him. And he was usually cast to star alongside one of the studio's big, popular leading ladies. Most notably, these are probably the 2 most famous films he made during these years: Blonde Venus with Marlene Dietrich, and She Done Him Wrong with Mae West. He made another film with Mae West called I'm No Angel. These were the best of the many films he made in the early 30s. But even in these films, he had quite bland parts. The roles required him to do little more than look good in a tuxedo, look charming, and he always, in all of his films of this period, he always has to tell the leading lady that she's irresistible and that he's madly in love with her. He says this over and over again in film after film, how madly he is in love with the leading lady. So when he looked back on this, part of his career, this frustrating part of his career, he said, "I was a mannequin." That's all he was in these films, was a mannequin, and he remembered that he longed to break free of these wooden roles. And in his own memoir, Cary Grant credited several directors, not just Hitchcock, but several directors, with helping him as an actor and helping him to forge a screen image. Hitchcock was one of them, but not the only one. So just briefly, I want to go through what other directors did for Cary Grant before he worked with Hitchcock. Then we can consider what was unique and distinctive about Hitchcock and Cary Grant. So if we go to the next slide, we start with George Concor, the director George Concor. He's really Cary Grant's first key director, and they made a bizarre film together. This is a very strange film. If you haven't seen it, it's worth catching. Called Sylvia Scarlet. Katharine Hepburn is the real star of the film, and she plays a girl dressing as a boy who has a lot of low-life adventures. You can see her there in the second frame in male clothing, looking rather convincing, I think. It's a rough and tumble film. It is a film set in a rough and tumble world, and it's said that George Concor knew something about Cary Grant's background. He knew about Cary Grant coming from a working class background, and that's why he wanted to cast him. That he has, as Cary Grant later put it, Concor saw that there might be something behind his smoothness, behind the facade of the mannequin. There might be something a little less bland, a little more interesting. So in Sylvia Scarlet, he cast Cary Grant as this Cockney scam artist and music hall performer, quite a shady, mean-spirited fellow. And for the first time, Cary Grant was able to play something more than the slick lover of the leading lady. So the film was Sylvia Scarlet was a terrible flop at the box office. It didn't do well at all. But Cary Grant won the best reviews of his career to date, and everyone suddenly took note of him. Everyone suddenly noticed that he could act and that he had a kind of screen presence that had not been apparent before. So the lasting impact of this first film with Concor, was that henceforth Cary Grant would always allow at least a bit of his darker side, his rougher origins, to shine through his polish. A bit of Archie Leach would always be apparent in Cary Grant. So Sylvia Scarlet was a breakthrough of sorts, but he had to leave Paramount, where he had the 5-year contract, and strike out as an independent star before he could really hit his stride. And one of his first post-Paramount films was The Awful Truth, directed by Leo McCarey. If we can go to the next slide, please. So Leo McCarey is not a particularly well-remembered director now, but he made some wonderful films, including this one, and he was pivotal to Cary Grant's career. The Awful Truth is a screwball comedy set among affluent, high society New Yorkers, And you can see Cary Grant is still looking a little bit like a mannequin there in this first image from the film at the top left, wearing his finery, his evening dress, in that very formal dressing room. But Leo McCarey had worked in silent films with slapstick, and he encouraged Cary Grant to improvise on set, and especially to use the physical comedy skills that Cary Grant had learned in music hall back in Britain and in vaudeville when he first came to America. McCarey urged Grant to use these skills for slapstick humor in films. And I would argue that this really humanized Cary Grant. You can see on the top right here that Cary Grant he's at a musical recital. It's a formal setting. He sits in a chair and he tries to lean back in his chair, and suddenly the chair goes out from beneath him, crashes to the floor, and then as he gets up in the lower frame there, he becomes entangled with it and makes an absolute fool of himself in the most delightful, comical way. So this became his trademark. The debonair facade is always there to be chipped away, little by little, with the audience intrigued to see how long Cary Grant can maintain his calm, cool, perfect demeanor with all of these calamities happening around him. It's a form of comedy that ensured that his polish and his sophistication never came across as narcissistic or one-dimensional. He was always too much of a clown to be truly sophisticated. He was always too silly to be stuffy. You could always see a little bit of Archie Leach vaudevillian in his pratfalls that he enjoyed taking so much on the set. So The Awful Truth was a huge success. If you haven't seen it, it's a really, really funny, delightful film. And it marks his arrival as a major star. This is the first time in 1937 that we see the Cary Grant that we all know now, and that we would see many more times over the years. But his next film, if we go to the next slide, was also another key step in his development. This one made with Howard Hawks, Bringing Up Baby, another great screwball comedy, which his first time working with director Howard Hawks. They would go on to make 4 more films together, but I think Bringing Up Baby was the most influential film, actually, of Cary Grant's whole career. Howard Hawks saw what Leo McCarey had done in The Awful Truth with Cary Grant, and he continued with some of the same elements. Improvisation, slapstick, chipping away at the perfect facade. But Howard Hawks and Cary Grant added some new elements in Bringing Up Baby. One was that the woman, Katharine Hepburn in this case, would always pursue Cary Grant in this film and in future films, often coming on quite strongly. You know, her desire for him is a really prominent part of this film. So that's one aspect. Another was that the challenges to his debonair facade would be greater, a succession of real indignities that would build up into a frenzy of frustration, and often one that deprives him of his dress sense, his perfect dress sense. So often his clothes are damaged. You can see he's covered in feathers in one of these frames. That's Katharine Hepburn's doing. She tears his dinner jacket in the top frame on the left. She steals his clothes and makes him dress in a frilly robe in the bottom right there. The famous scene where the older woman in the frame there is asking him, why are you wearing those clothes? And he ad-libs, I just went gay all of a sudden. So Hepburn's desire for him and her pursuit of him is ultimately liberating for him. But first, he must be stripped down, deprived of his manner, his composure, his dignity. After Bringing Up Baby, Cary Grant made a succession of comedies that really solidified his popularity. A really, really good chain of films: Holiday, Gunga Din, His Girl Friday, My Favorite Wife, and The Philadelphia Story, all within 2 years. This remarkable run of films. And in 1940, after those films were done, Alfred Hitchcock was tasked with making a screwball comedy. So Alfred Hitchcock called up Cary Grant and said, I'm going to make this screwball comedy called Mr. and Mrs. Smith. You are the king of screwball comedy. Let's make this together. So he was asked to make it by Hitchcock. Hitchcock thought this was his big chance to work with Cary Grant, and Cary Grant turned him down. He told Hitchcock that he wanted a break from screwball comedy, that he was afraid of being typecast, and that the audience would grow tired of these sorts of hijinks if he made film after film as a screwball comedy. He also said, very importantly, that he longed to play a villain. Cary Grant longed to play a villain. He'd been saying this for years. Cary Grant had been saying this for years, but it was only when he said it to Hitchcock that anyone took notice of Cary Grant's desire to play a villain. So Hitchcock had to make Mr. and Mrs. Smith with Robert Montgomery. And then once that was done, Hitchcock set out to find a story in which Cary Grant could play the villain. If we can have the next slide, please. Suspicion was their first film together, the first Hitchcock-Grant film. And Alfred Hitchcock told Cary Grant the story over lunch, I think in his office at RKO Studio. And Grant, just having heard about the story at lunch, signed up that he would play Johnny Aysgarth in Suspicion. So Johnny Aysgarth is a handsome, debonair fellow, but he's also a kind of ne'er-do-well from a family that's lost all its money, it's lost its wealth, it's lost its social status, and Johnny is resentful and eager to lie, steal, and cheat to get what he thinks he's entitled to, his status and his family's wealth back. So Cary Grant didn't often play British characters, and I think it's really interesting that when he does, in Suspicion, he's an outsider. He's an outsider, and he has a grievance against the class system. So his character, Johnny Aysgarth, marries this mousy upper-class woman, Lena, played by Joan Fontaine, and then she, Lena, begins to suspect that Johnny is going to murder her. Can we have the next slide, please? So this story came from a novel, Before the Fact, in which Johnny really does kill Lena. And the opening sentence of the novel lays out the plot very directly and just a little bit melodramatically. That's the first line of the novel I've printed for you there. Some women give birth to murderers, some go to bed with them, and some marry them. Lena Aysgarth had lived with her husband for nearly 8 years before she realized that she was married to a murderer. So this was the kind of story that Hitchcock loved. It's not a whodunit. It's not a mystery that's going to be figured out by a detective through a process of mental deduction. It's not an Agatha Christie style story. It's a suspense story in which all of the characters circle around one another warily. And the audience waits to find out whether the characters' suspicions are founded. Is Lena right that Johnny is a murderer? They wait to find out if he is a murderer, how is he going to do it? How will he commit the murder? Or will he be stopped in time? Will he be caught if he does murder her? These are the kinds of questions that are left open. Next slide, please. So what's different and really interesting about Suspicion for Alfred Hitchcock as well is that it begins as though it's one of these sophisticated Cary Grant comedies. You can see in the still on the left there, it begins in this bright, cheery, funny mode. And Cary Grant seems to be playing his usual breezy charmer, having a whirlwind romance with Joan Fontaine's character. But gradually the mood darkens and it becomes less predictable and a more mysterious film as it proceeds. And this shift in tone from light romantic comedy to gothic thriller is quite unusual. This was by no means an ordinary trajectory. So Hitchcock filmed the scenes in chronological order. He filmed the story in chronological order, presumably so that this change of register in the film, going from light to dark, was very clear for the actors. And you can also see that it's very clear in the lighting. The film actually gets darker and darker as it goes along. From this early happy moment to the famous scene on the right, when Lena suspects that Johnny's trying to kill her, and she's so worried, she's so anxious about this that she's taken to her bed upstairs. Cary Grant brings her, or Johnny brings her a glass of milk up the stairs, and you can see that there's a sort of spider web pattern across the frame there. The house has become like a spider's web, and the question is, who's spinning the web and who's trapped? Hitchcock famously lit the milk from within. He put a light bulb within the glass of milk so that it would give off this spooky, scary aura. But it's a wonderfully, that shot on the right is a wonderfully ambiguous one, because it makes the audience ask if Lena is mad. Is Lena the one who's casting this web of suspicion around an innocent Johnny? Or is Johnny really the spider spinning the web to trap her? And it's telling that we see him in silhouette, so that his charm isn't on show. If you take away Cary Grant's handsome facade, Hitchcock suggests, there's no telling what you'll find in the darkness. And this ambiguity continues right up until the final scene, when Lena and Johnny go for a ride in a car along a cliff-top road. And if we could have the next slide, please. The car speeds along the cliff top, and she thinks that he's trying to push her out of the car, push her out onto the cliffs. But he later insists that, no, I wasn't trying to push you out. I thought you were falling and I was trying to pull you back into the car. And as you can see, it's filmed in a way that makes him look like a psychopath reaching out to push her. That's as disturbing as we ever see Cary Grant in a film. But it's never really definitively clear in Suspicion whether Johnny intends to murder Lena. It is clear that Cary Grant was not typecast in Suspicion. He did not need to worry about typecasting in this film. It certainly never looked like this before. Next slide, please. He later said privately that it wasn't hard to play someone who looked as if he wanted to kill Joan Fontaine, the actress playing Lena. A sort of rare moments of rudeness for him. He wasn't usually critical of his co-stars, but he and Joan Fontaine didn't get along well on the set, and he probably resented her for winning the best actress Oscar for Suspicion. She won the Oscar that year. So Joan Fontaine wrote in her memoir that the tensions with Cary Grant on the set arose because Cary Grant, made the mistake of not realizing that Lena was the film's major role. She wrote in her memoir, "It was through Lena's eyes that the story unfolded. Lena had all the sympathy. Cary found this out only midway through the shooting schedule." And I guess you can see her point to an extent. The film does center on Lena's perceptions of Johnny. And through much of the film, we see her looking at him, desiring him, fearing him, imagining what he might be capable of. But on the other hand, it's Johnny who is captivating. It's Johnny who captivates her, and Johnny who I think captivates the audience. So 2 points, I think I can make 2 points that confirm that Joan Fontaine was wrong about her perception of the film. If we can have the next slide, please. That this was really Cary Grant's film. One is that Cary Grant had top billing in Suspicion. And this is not a minor detail in Hollywood. One of the things in his one of the major components of his files is all of his contracts. And like all Hollywood contracts for stars, I think there are endless clauses and subclauses about how big his name will be, whether or not his name on the title cards, whether or not his name will be shared with another star, who will be on top, so on and so forth. So it's very clear here, it's Cary Grant's film. His name is first, his name is on top. The other point is that when the head of RKO Pictures, George Schaefer, told Hitchcock, I don't like the title before the fact, the title of the novel. He said, I don't like that title. Let's change it to Suspicion. Hitchcock sent Schaefer this telegram that you can see saying that Hitchcock saying that he hated the title Suspicion. Hitchcock's preferred title was Johnny, leaving no doubt who he thought had the major role in the film. And I think the camera work as well leaves no doubt about this. Hitchcock represents Johnny as an object of desire, a man to be looked at. And this fits with a broader fascination in Hitchcock's work, a kind of Dorian Gray concept in which the handsome good looks of the star may hide a corrupt and depraved soul. Hitchcock's very first thriller, The Lodger, in 1926, the silent film The Lodger, was from a play called Who Is He? And it centers on a family who takes in a handsome lodger and slowly realizes that handsome lodger may be a serial killer. And I think this title, Who Is He? And this concept of who is he behind the handsome facade could serve as the title of each of the 4 films that Hitchcock made with Cary Grant, all concerned with probing just how deep or superficial Cary Grant's charm may be. Next slide, please. After Suspicion, Cary Grant wanted Hitchcock to direct him in his own pet project known as The Lonely Heart. This was Cary Grant's most personal film, in which he plays a poor British working class drifter who has a troubled relationship with his mother, something very like Cary Grant's own background. And Hitchcock declined this project, which is a shame, really, because it would have been interesting to see Hitchcock and Grant make a film about backstreet working class life in London, something that they both knew from personal experience. And instead, None But the Lonely Heart was made by the left-wing American playwright Clifford Odets, who was quite heavy-handed in his approach to the film, and it's not really a success on any level. Hitchcock, meanwhile, asked Cary Grant to star in Spellbound, but this time it was Cary Grant who declined. In 1944 and 1945, Cary Grant sank into a major depression as his second marriage to the Woolworths heiress, Barbara Hutton, failed. He stopped working for a full year, and the Spellbound part went to Gregory Peck. Gregory Peck used to joke that every time he read a script, he knew that Cary Grant had read it before him and turned it down. He said that Cary Grant's fingerprints were all over every script he read throughout his entire career, and it was certainly true of Spellbound. Next slide, please. So a year later, in 1946, Hitchcock and Cary Grant got together again for Notorious, with Cary Grant playing a CIA agent who recruits Ingrid Bergman to be a kind of Mata Hari-style spy, going undercover and seducing the leader of a Nazi spy ring in South America. So this film combined 2 of Hitchcock's favorite genres, the spy film and the Gothic melodrama. And again, if you haven't seen this film, this is a wonderful, wonderful film. It's also probably Cary Grant's darkest role. Right from the beginning, Hitchcock is intent on leading the audience to question just how cold, how brutal, how damaged Cary Grant's character might be. So this next still, if we can see the next slide, please. This still is from the very near the beginning of the film. It's the first scene with Cary Grant in it, and the camera stays in this position. There we go. Stays in this position for a full 90 seconds. Quite a long take, and looking at the back of Cary Grant's head. And I think most people would have recognized the back of Cary Grant's head. This was Cary Grant's 49th film, Notorious, so people were apt to recognize him. And I think, as in the sequence we talked about from Suspicion, Hitchcock is calling our attention to the mysteriousness here, the darkness here, the unknowability of Cary Grant, and asking us to think about, should we trust him? Should we trust him simply because he's well groomed? Isn't there something malevolent in his perfection and in his inscrutability here? And to go back to the play title, Who Is He? That fascination Hitchcock had with leading the audience to think about who this character might really be. The character's name in Notorious, Cary Grant's character's name is Devlin, which is a sort of scrambled version of devil. He doesn't have horns, but Hitchcock gives us plenty of warning that this is not the happy, friendly screwball Cary Grant of screwball comedies. We can see the next slide, please. This is one shot. These four images are one shot where Cary Grant enters into Ingrid Bergman's bedroom, and we see him from her point of view. This is Ingrid Bergman's point of view, looking at Cary Grant as she rolls over in bed. This image of him spins round so that he goes from being upright to upside down as she tries to figure him out, as she tries to get the right perspective on him. It's the scene in which he recruits her to be a spy, to go undercover, to go on a mission that could easily lead to her death. And as in Suspicion, the female lead is both in love with him and worried that he may be so cold and heartless as to leave her to die. So the similarities between the two films, I think the difference between them is that Notorious is much more romantic. Some say it's actually Hitchcock's most romantic film because it's clear that Grant's character really does love Bergman's character. Devlin really does love Alicia. And this is established in the film in a very intensely romantic scene. We can see the next slide. When they first arrived in South America, this is in Brazil, and she has a flat overlooking Copacabana Beach, and they begin kissing. In this first image on the top left, they begin kissing in a long shot that shows the beach in the background and sets this beautiful atmosphere. But then the camera comes in close to a close-up that's held for a full 2.5 minutes. 2.5 minutes of this kissing. Not always locked-lipped kissing. It's actually more intimate than if they kissed locked-lipped the entire time. They kiss lightly, they kiss heavily, they nuzzle one another, they stroke one another. At one point, as you can see in the bottom picture, he makes a telephone call while they continue to kiss and nuzzle one another. So the stars hated filming this scene. They found it awkward for obvious reasons, and they thought it was going to look terribly unnatural on the screen. And Hitchcock joked that he was allowing audiences to have a temporary ménage à trois with these two beautiful stars. But he was also making audiences believe that this couple are so in love that they can barely allow their lips to part, which of course makes it all the more painful to watch as Devlin puts Alicia undercover in this Nazi household and then grows contemptuous of her for doing her job, for becoming romantically involved with the Nazi as she is intended to do. So if it is a romantic film, it's one that admits that a sadistic character like Devlin would naturally fall for a masochistic character like Alicia, and that only a fairy tale ending can bring them happiness. As Devlin, Grant is surprisingly cold and grim after this kissing scene. His hard-hearted performance was a real change of pace for him, and one that audiences apparently loved because this was a hugely successful film. Next slide, please. Hitchcock didn't want to let Grant go after Notorious. They worked so well together. He didn't want to let him go. He wanted Cary Grant to be the star of Rope, of I Confess, and of Dial M for Murder, all films that Hitchcock made with other actors. So Hitchcock's writers have said that when Hitchcock was planning his films, when he was talking about the stories and developing the stories, he often assumed that Cary Grant was going to be the star of the films. And so he would refer to the male lead in the stories. They talked about which way the story might go. He'd refer to the male lead as Carrie as they talked through the story, even though often it didn't end up being Carrie. So Cary Grant turned his nose up at a lot of these films. He he demanded a very high salary, which wasn't always met. And in 1952, he actually Cary Grant stopped making films for 2 years, and word got out that he had retired from the screen. Then in 1954, Hitchcock made him an offer he could not refuse. We can see the next slide. And this was, of course, To Catch a Thief, their third film together. The story about a former acrobat, like Cary Grant, former acrobat turned jewel thief, was obviously perfect for him. And the film was made on the Riviera, shot on location on the Riviera, all expenses paid, of course. Grace Kelly was his co-star, the most elegant star in Hollywood at the time. And Hitchcock wanted Grant so badly that he met his salary demands by giving him a percentage of his own profits from the film. Hitchcock agreed to take fewer profits from the film himself so that Cary Grant could have more money. Next slide, please. And Hitchcock was so pleased about bringing Grant back to the screen that I think he plays upon this in the film's early scenes. Cary Grant's character, John Roby, has retired at the beginning of the film. The character in the film is retired from a life of crime, and he's seen living in retirement at a villa overlooking Cannes, in much the same way that Cary Grant retired to a sort of hilltop house in Beverly Hills. At the beginning of the film, the police come to accuse John Roby of a new robbery, a new jewel robbery that has all of Roby's trademarks, and he flees out the back door and runs and catches a bus to evade the police. And as he sits down on the bus, as you can see in the bottom frame, he looks to his right and sees a bird in a cage, and he does a double take, and then he looks to his left and he sees Hitchcock looking nonchalant, Hitchcock's cameo appearance. So I think the joke here is that Hitchcock had captured him in a very gilded cage. And it was a gilded cage because To Catch a Thief is such a bright, scenic, funny, really lovely film. But once again, Hitchcock poses the question, who is he, by having Grant's character appear in a variety of guises. So at first you can see in the top frame there, or in both frames, he's wearing this casual striped pullover. He's said to be living on the Riviera. He looks like he lives on the Riviera with his tan and his sweater. But then we see him in a number of different guises. If we can go to the next slide. There we go. Just going clockwise, we see him in a red plaid bathing suit, which he finds on a boat when he's trying to escape. He puts it on, saying, "No one will recognize me in this," and then swims ashore. And of course, everyone looks at him wearing a bathing suit. He disguises himself as a fisherman, which you can see there. He disguises himself as an American tourist at a casino. And throughout the film, there is a lingering suspicion that he may actually be the jewel thief called the Cat, because he scampers across rooftops, and we of course see him in that mode by the end of the film. So Grace Kelly's character is clearly attracted to Roby, thinking that he is the Cat. If we can go to the next slide, please. She thinks he is the Cat, and she is attracted to him on that basis. She tells him that he's not convincing in any other guise. As she says, "You're like an American character in an English movie." And of course, she's saying this to an English character in an American movie. And Cary Grant was certainly in on this joke. He would later explain that his films with Hitchcock worked because he got the audience, Cary Grant, got the audience on his side by playing his roles as though the action wasn't really happening to him. He let the audience know that he was on their side. He was entertaining them rather than trying to convince them that the far-fetched story should be taken seriously. So there's always this wry, ironic dimension to Cary Grant's films particularly with To Catch a Thief and the next one, North by Northwest. So To Catch a Thief reignited his career. And I think Hitchcock can take credit for reinventing the Cary Grant film. After To Catch a Thief, from To Catch a Thief onward, all of Cary Grant's films would be, as To Catch a Thief is, in color, in widescreen, filmed on some very picturesque location, and they would all feature the kind of light, sexy, tongue-in-cheek banter that Grace Kelly and Cary Grant do so well in this scene. So Hitchcock really showed Cary Grant how to extend his stardom into the 1950s and 1960s. Next slide, please. Their last collaboration was, I think almost everyone agrees, their best. It's well known that Hitchcock and screenwriter Ernest Lehman set out to make the ultimate Hitchcock film with North by Northwest. It's often referred to as the ultimate Hitchcock film. It's a spy story that's a chase from beginning to end. It involves train journeys and planes that appear from nowhere. It's a story of an innocent man wrongly accused. There's an elegant blonde and icy blonde who may or may not be helping the accused man. And the climax of the film is set in a very public place. All of these Hitchcockian elements. They're performed as a kind of medley in North by Northwest. It's like Alfred Hitchcock's greatest hits. But by this time, making the ultimate Hitchcock film was not so different from making the ultimate Cary Grant film. Next slide, please. This is a story about facades. It begins with the image of a shiny building on Madison Avenue, home to America's advertising industry, as all fans of Mad Men will know. So this is a building that reflects the identity of the observer rather than having any real identity of its own. It's a story that begins that way, and a story that ends with Grant as the wrongly accused man, clinging precariously from Mount Rushmore, that monument to American patriotism. Seen here is a very cold, hostile, lifeless space. So in between this beginning and end, we have a story of Roger O. Thornhill, the character Roger O. Thornhill, a Madison Avenue executive so slick, so facile, that he seems to have no substance or real identity at all. And when he's asked, what does the O stand for in Roger O. Thornhill, he replies, nothing. So it's a film that on one level is about Cary Grant. His facade is so carefully constructed and maintained with such polish for so long that he could seem completely facile. And there are some really distinctive similarities between Cary Grant and Roger O. Thornhill. Thornhill is a character who has two names because he's mistaken for George Kaplan in the film, so he seems to be both George Kaplan and Roger Thornhill, just as Cary Grant was Cary Grant and Archie Leach. Roger Thornhill is perfectly tailored in a grey suit that shows no wear and tear, no matter what happens to him, as Cary Grant was always perfectly dressed. Roger Thornhill is twice divorced, as Cary Grant was in 1959. Roger Thornhill is constantly worried about his domineering mother, as Cary Grant was always. And he's accused by the villain, Thornhill is accused by the villain, James Mason, of being a bad actor. In one scene, James Mason tells him, you're a bad actor. You should go have some training at the Actors Studio in New York. And Cary Grant had often expressed his disdain for the Actors Studio and method acting, and expressed this in public. And both Roger Thornhill and Cary Grant are cool and suave and have a witty quip for any occasion. So as in all Cary Grant films, the story of North by Northwest works to test the boundaries of his suave demeanor. But in North by Northwest, it's really like 5 films in one. He's put through the ringer, 5 different ringers, as never before. If we can see the next slide. So I've got 5 acts laid out here over a few slides. At the end of the first act, he's forced to drink a bottle of whiskey and then put behind the wheel of a car for another one of these wild cliff-top rides that nearly kills him. And the second act ends with him at the United Nations, where a diplomat is stabbed in the back, and Grant's character is left holding the knife and looking like the murderer. If we can have the next slide again. The famous crop dusting scene there in the third image, the third act ends with the crop dusting scene in which Cary Grant's character is chased across barren cornfields by a crop dusting plane. That plane's dust and crops where there ain't no crops, an observer says. And the scene is so barren and this plot device is so thin that the character seems to be running from his own emptiness. There's a sort of existential quality to this plane chasing Cary Grant across the empty fields. And note that the suit here really can withstand any ordeal it's put through. The plane descends upon him, sprays him, makes him dive into the dirt. There are bullets landing all around him, and when he stands up, he simply dusts off the suit and then walks away. The fourth act ends when his character is apparently shot. You can see Eva Marie Saint has apparently shot him there at point blank range, with George Washington watching from the top of Mount Rushmore there. And next slide, please. Finally, the fifth act has Cary Grant hanging from Mount Rushmore itself, hanging by his fingernails from Mount Rushmore. And he will escape this too, and he'll save Eva Marie Saint, but not before. You'll notice she is ripping his suit as she falls. So finally, the suit proves to be vulnerable. So I think the idea is Cary Grant's clothes can withstand everything and anything except the responsibilities associated with romance, sex, marriage. It's tempting to think that having made this ultimate Hitchcock film, ultimate Cary Grant film, the director and the star made a conscious decision not to work together anymore, that they'd done the perfect film, done all they could achieve together, fulfilled their ambitions. But actually, after North by Northwest, they continued talking to one another about the possibility of another film. And I think if you look at a film like The Birds, you can see that the Rod Taylor part is very much like something Cary Grant would play. Cary Grant wasn't very likely to agree to have seagulls thrown at him, as happens in The Birds, but nevertheless, the character is one that has a sort of Cary Grant charm to it. Hitchcock really pressed Grant hard to make Torn Curtain with him, the role that ultimately went to Paul Newman. But by 1966, when Torn Curtain was made, Cary Grant had decided to retire. This time he really did retire. He retired for good in 1966. And 13 years later, if we can go to the next slide, 13 years later, in 1979, when they were both pretty much retired, Hitchcock retired as well, Grant appeared at the American Film Institute's tribute to Alfred Hitchcock. And they were so close that Cary Grant was seated right next to Alfred Hitchcock. Hitchcock had on one side of him his wife, and on the other side of him Cary Grant. And all the other stars and co-workers had to go sit somewhere else. And afterwards, after this tribute, where you can see Cary Grant toasted him, was the final person to speak and to toast him, Hitchcock wrote him a letter of thanks, saying, "I can hardly write this letter without a tear in my eye because of our fondness for each other. How wonderful for you to be present at the tribute. May I have the privilege of filming you again one day, because you can be filmed again, you know." So right up to the end of their lives, Hitchcock died in 1980, Hitchcock died the next year, and Grant died in 1986. Right up to the end of their lives, Hitchcock was urging Cary Grant to come out of retirement and make just one more film with him. And I think this was a fitting end to a collaboration based on friendship, to be sure, but also based on a really strong respect for each other's talent and a creative rapport that made their films together so rich, so challenging, and so entertaining. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Mark. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm particularly impressed at the thought of you sitting there with a timer timing the kiss in North by Northwest. If I may give another quick little plug for libraries, we do have talks coming up on Carol Lombard and James Mason, both of whom have been mentioned this evening as Okay, we haven't got that much time left, but if we overrun and people have to go, this talk is being recorded, so you will all be sent a link to the recording, so you can watch it if you have to leave early. Anyway, we have, as you can imagine, a lot of questions, so I will try and ask you some. Okay, this is one really interests me from Mabina. What was the most exciting thing for you to see personally in the collection, in the Cary Grant collection?
Ooh, probably his Boy Scout diary from when he was 13 and 14 years old, that said what he was doing every day when he was growing up in Bristol. It was just fascinating. It was very hard. It was a little tiny diary with little tiny writing. It was hard to decipher. It's absolutely thrilling to get that that sort of insight into a part of his life I knew nothing about.
This is the one that lists when he had fish and chips, and
that's right.
Yeah. Eric has asked, I'm interested in why Cary Grant never changed his appearance. Yes.
Why he never changed his appearance? He did change his appearance a little bit as he went along, but I think his appearance worked so well there was no real need to change it. Right? When you see his really early films, his hair is styled differently, and it was Joseph von Sternberg famously told him, "No, part your hair this way," and it does make a big difference in him, and that the sort of severity of the new haircut grows more and more severe as time goes by, I think. But it worked. Let's put it that way. His look worked.
Anthony has asked, and I think you've sort of answered it, so we'll twist it around. Anthony has asked, did he consciously avoid playing murderers in his films? So according to you, he wanted to play murderers. So I guess it's, why was he not cast as one ever? The money men, the producers, were always adamant that would not work. That it wouldn't work to have him definitively defined as a murderer, that audiences would not accept this. And in fact, they tested suspicion with preview audiences and found that audiences really didn't like it and didn't want him to be a murderer. And so they left it ambiguous. Mm. Yeah, Lucy makes the point that a lot of the audience would have assumed that he is the murderer in suspicion. He's just going to do it anyway as soon as the camera ends. Several people have said, Steph has said, of the movies they made together, what was their absolute favourite?
What was their favourite, or
what was their favourite? Do we know which their favourite was?
Well, you know, that I would say it wasn't, if you think about the making of it, it wasn't North by Northwest, because that was actually their that was a very hard film to make, and they did come close to arguing on the set of that film. I think probably To Catch a Thief, because it was they had such a wonderful time together. They both took their families to the south of France and had a sort of summer there with Grace Kelly, and went to all the best restaurants, and yeah, I think that was probably their finest time.
Lucy has asked, how could he have passed up the chance to work with Carole Lombard in Mr. and Mrs. Smith? I was trying to remember, he'd already worked with her, hadn't he? In Name Only.
Yes, he made Name Only. It's a real shame. They made a couple of other early films together as well, although Cary Grant has a much lesser role in those films. It's a shame they never made a comedy together, because they were both, just perfect screwball comedy stars. But yes, they made a melodrama together called In Name Only, which was really only moderately successful.
Did Cary Grant ever express a preference for a particular leading lady?
Grace Kelly, all the way.
Ah.
he never faltered, and he would say, Ingrid Bergman's wonderful too, but he only made one film with Grace Kelly, and every time he was asked that question after working with her, he said she was so natural, so spontaneous, so there with him in the moment on set, that he just adored working with her. And then he and Bergman were great friends, and he respected her a lot too. But it was Grace Kelly.
Someone anonymous has said, did Hitchcock enjoy chipping away at Grant's Debonair Facade, just as he did with Anthony Perkins' Boy Next Door image and Psycho.
Yeah, I think you can see what Alfred Hitchcock is doing with Cary Grant taken to an extreme in Psycho. That idea that I think when audiences first went to see Psycho in 1960, and Anthony Perkins had played wholesome roles before that, and audiences didn't know where the story was going. I think that was part of the terror of Psycho, was finding out, you know, it's another film that could be called Who Is He? Let's put it that way.
Someone has asked how the Mount Rushmore scene was shot. I kind of assume not. Is it shot on Mount Rushmore?
Well, they went to Mount Rushmore, and the park authorities didn't want them to film on the monument, so they let them film around the monument. That scene I showed, that's in the cafe where Eva Marie Saint shoots in, that's in the real cafe out Mount Rushmore. They wouldn't let them on the monument, so they made a huge model of the monument back in Hollywood at the MGM studio lot. And if you Google this, you can find pictures of the way they did it. It's really interesting to see. They made these giant facades in the studio and had the stars clambering all over them.
By the way, I'm leaving out a lot of compliments, which you can read afterwards, because there's a lot of people saying they're really enjoying it. Pam has asked, this is, I guess, a bit unfair because it's not Hitchcock, is Charade the best non-Hitchcock film ever made? And just another plug here, we have a talk coming up on Audrey Hepburn. So,
yeah, I guess it is. I mean, I think it does what Hitchcock does perfectly. I've never heard Hitchcock talk about Charade, but Stanley Donen, who directed Charade, would get really upset when people said this to him. When people said, "Oh, it's like, you know, it's just like a Hitchcock film," he would say, "Hitchcock doesn't own all of that stuff. That's not Hitchcock's." But I think he was wrong.
Yeah. So, sorry, I'm peering a bit. Oh yeah, this is quite an interesting one. When Hitchcock said the only actor I've ever loved, someone has said, is it safe to assume that he actually meant male actor? So were there any actresses Hitchcock did love?
You know, that's a very good point. I think at that time, actor and actress were, you would use those terms to mean male and female. So I think he probably did mean the only male actor I ever loved. And he certainly loved some of his actresses. He was incredibly fond of Ingrid Bergman and was brokenhearted when she left Hollywood to go to Italy with Roberto Rossellini. And he loved Grace Kelly and was brokenhearted when she went to Monaco to become Princess Grace. So he had really strong, friendly, amicable relationships with both of those stars, and you know, really valued them. They both felt as though they could spar with him, as though they had a lot of creative input into the films, and he valued that.
Okay. Anne Marie has asked, which are your favourite Hitchcock films and Cary Grant films?
Well, I mean, I do love North by Northwest, and I see its importance, and you know, I admire it tremendously. But I have this strange love of Suspicion. I find that if I ever see Suspicion on, I just fall into it and watch it all over again. I love teaching it with students. It's an uneven film, and it's not a perfectly realized film, but somehow that makes it more interesting to me. The kind of the mess of it, they couldn't decide while they were making it whether Cary Grant really had murdered her or not. They wanted him to murder her, and then the studio was like, well, he can't actually murder her. And so I don't think either one of them knew as they were going along exactly what the story was, and they had to refilm the ending a couple of times. And it somehow, the mess of it works for me.
We just have a comment from someone called Roz, who's actually in Leytonstone, whereas we all know Hitchcock came from, and she mentions, have we all seen the mosaics in the underpass that celebrate Hitchcock? Yeah. Someone has asked about what do you know anything about the relationship, Hitchcock's relationship with Jimmy Stewart, who he also made 4 films with?
Yes, I mean, I think they had a very good working relationship, and I think they got on well. And I think Hitchcock found Jimmy Stewart a less demanding star. That, you know, Cary Grant would walk onto the set and say, I don't like that, and I don't like that, and I don't like the, you know, costumes that the co-stars are wearing. And he was very fastidious, and he was notoriously difficult. Cary Grant was, but Hitchcock would look at it and go, oh yeah, you're right, that is wrong. Let's redo that. So I think he found Jimmy Stewart easier, and I think he got along very well with Jimmy Stewart, but I don't think they had the kind of close rapport that Grant and Hitchcock had.
Okay, and then someone's asked, yes, as you mentioned Cary Grant's depressions, did he come out of these as a result of Hitchcock offering him a film that interested him?
Yes, I think his work was what brought him out. He had a few depressions in his life, and where he kind of came to a halt, and just stopped working for a while. And it was work that ultimately, usually to do with a romance going wrong, and I think work brought him out of that. Work saved him from his depressions.
Okay, and I think just one last question from Helen. Am I right in remembering that Hitch always wanted to be Cary Grant? Was he he was his idealized version of himself in looks and charm?
I think so, and I think that's part of what's going on in Notorious, is that Hitchcock is sort of showing Ingrid Bergman that the smooth guy, the smooth, handsome guy, is facile. Will leave you, will put you in danger, whereas you know, the alternate, the Nazi in the film is a kind of unattractive middle-aged man played by Claude Rains, who really does love Ingrid and would never betray her in that way. So there's an interesting dynamic going on in that film where Hitchcock clearly would like to be Cary Grant and also sort of resents Cary Grant's charm and good looks.
Okay, well, I think we're going to close now on one last comment from Kath, who says, this was a delight. I'm going to get his book and pay full price because Mr. Glancy deserves it. So I think we all agree with that, though there will be copies, hopefully, at your local library. Well, thank you, Mark. Going to close now. Please, everybody, if you want to see more talks like this, we do have plenty coming up, not just on films. We've got on other subjects too. So good night, everybody.
Thank you.